Broken Chains. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 1 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 21. The moving picture with sound, appearing on the black screen on the wall, were entirely new to Tor. He might not remember much about his past, but it definitely hadn't included movies. Unlike Catena, who had seen this one so many times, she knew many of the lines by heart. In fact, she'd fallen asleep before he'd found out how the story ended, curling up on her side on her couch while he'd watched every moment. Now he was torn. As her protector, surely it fell to him to make sure she was warm and comfortable as she slept, instead of all cramped on the couch, when she had a large fine bed in another room. Yet he didn't want to wake her, and while he was more than up to the task of carrying her to her bedchamber, now he knew his body's reaction to touching her, he wasn't sure if he should. Well, it wasn't like he was going to ravish her as she slept, he reasoned, no matter how much certain parts of his body relished that idea. His head ruled here, and he would protect her from any and all threats, including the wicked parts of himself. He couldn't remember the last time a woman had made him feel like this. After all, he couldn't remember much of anything, but he suspected there was something special about Catena that made her utterly unique. Why else was he charged with protecting her? Carefully, he scooped her up from the couch, shifting her weight until her head rested snugly against his chest. Her hair smelled like exotic fruit, sweet and sensual all at the same time. He breathed deep, savoring it as surely as he had the bacon smells in her kitchen. "I'm a librarian," she mumbled, rubbing her face against his chest. Tor smiled. Another line from the movie that she knew by heart. She was a strange woman in an even stranger world. Carrying his precious cargo, he remembered not to slip through the walls, and instead trudged through doorways and passages to reach her room, where he laid her on the bed. She'd made a point of going off to change into her nightclothes, so he knew she wouldn't mind if he peeled back the coverlet and pulled it over her. Then he was at a loss for what to do. He could watch over her as she slept, he supposed, but the cafe across the road had since closed, and most of the people outside had dispersed. All of Catena's doors were locked, so there were no threats to her, inside or outside, for him to watch for. Watching her sleep made his mouth inexplicably dry, or drier than usual, given he was made of stone. He cast his eyes about her room, looking for something, anything that might pose a threat to her that he might deal with. Wait, was that a crack in the wall, up near the ceiling? Indeed it was. A hairline crack in the plaster, but as he delved deeper, he found the crack originated in the limestone wall itself. Oh, that would never do. Her house could not be permitted to fall down around her while she slept. He'd seen some construction materials downstairs, where someone was rebuilding the road during the day, so he borrowed a little of the limestone and a lot of other things, and set to work. Sometime during the night, as he worked to fill the gaps in the crumbling limestone, cursing the poor quality of the stuff, he had a flash of memory, his own voice cursing the stone as bright sunlight beat down on him and the tall white wall. "If you don't build buttresses, one good gust of wind'll send the walls toppling," he heard himself say. "If we build buttresses, the prisoners will climb up them and escape. You do as you're told. The engineers know what they're doing. They don't if they're not building buttresses. You do as you're told, convict, or it'll be manacles and motley for you. It'll be manacles and motley for everyone, for when these UN buttressed walls come down, everyone will escape." Pain turned the memory blinding white, and Tor found himself blinking at Catena's wall again, though he still felt the sharp sting of the lash on his back and the weight of the manacles at his ankles. Of all the memories of his past, this was one he'd have happily forgotten. Back to work then, for working stone always made him forget anything but the wall in front of him. He might not remember much, but he knew how to build and maintain a wall that would last for centuries. Maybe it was a gargoyle thing, or maybe it was something he remembered from before, but it didn't matter. By the time the sun rose, he'd carefully patched every wall in her bedroom and the kitchen too. Tomorrow night he'd do more, until Catena's house was as sound and secure as any lady's castle. His salt-tongued lady scholar deserved no less. 22. Catena woke when the sun rose, to find she was securely tucked into her own bed, and Tor was nowhere to be seen. The TV was still on in the lounge room. She'd evidently fallen asleep before the movie ended, and Tor hadn't known how to turn it off. Something else she'd have to explain to her new gargoyle roommate, who needed more than one pair of Maria's old cargo pants to wear. Catena knew nothing about men's clothes or sizing, but she knew someone who did, Taylor, who owned the menswear store downstairs. If Catena covered Tor's wings with a big coat, maybe she'd be able to bring him down to try things on. Oh, but he couldn't come out during the day, so it'd have to be at night. "Good morning," Catena called as she spotted Taylor unlocking her door. "Morning. It's too cold to be good." "Can't wait until it's summer again," Taylor said. "I'll be ordering the summer stock today, and the spring collection's just come in." "But it's only June." "That's the way the fashion industry works. Always a few months ahead of where anyone else has any sense being," Taylor said. "Oh, speaking of strange timing, a colleague of mine has just flown in and none of his luggage arrived with him, so he's got nothing to wear, and he's working at the university tomorrow. Is there any chance you could stay open a little later tonight, so I could bring him in to buy a few things to tide him over? He's asleep now. He says he can't sleep on planes and time zones are a killer, but when he wakes up later." Catena drifted off hopefully. Taylor shook her head. "Sorry, doll, my son's got a dentist appointment this afternoon, so I have to close early as it is. Tell you what though. You know where the spare keys are. Bring him in when he wakes up and try things on anyway. Leave the tags on the cash register and I'll bill you tomorrow morning for them. Oh, and the stock take sale starts tomorrow, where I'll discount all the remaining winter stock to half price. The sale rack will be here in the back. Check that first. He'll want winter clothes if it's for this week." Catena thanked her profusely. She checked the footpath outside, which was miraculously free of reporters, and headed out to work for the day. 23. A scratchy voice found him within the walls of Catena's house, while the wan winter sunlight kept him captive. "I can help you escape," the voice said. "Meet me here after dark. You can help me and I can help you." Tor didn't trust that voice, not one bit, and he'd wanted to ignore it. Wanted to forget the florid face of the butcher, his cleaver still dripping from the sheep he'd just slaughtered, as he nodded knowingly at Tor's chains. "I know you want to escape. Come here after dark and I'll help you." Then all was dark, except the striations of the stone. Calming and familiar, cold and hard, but inside he was screaming at himself not to trust the butcher. Yet somehow he'd silenced the screaming, or it had been drowned out by the clink of his chains and the agony of his lashed back, and he'd been seduced by that scratchy whisper. The same voice that urged him to protect her. Of course he'd protect Catena. How could he not? And yet when the scratchy voice ordered him to do it, he longed to rebel. To resist. But how could he possibly resist her? 24. Can we watch more of those moving pictures? Tor asked before Catena had even put her keys down. She had to laugh. He'd known about TV for a day, and already he was addicted to it. Sure. Actually, there's blockout blinds in the lounge room. If you keep those down during the day, it should keep enough sunlight out of the room for you to stay in there and watch whatever you want to while I'm at work. I'll show you how to use everything tonight, before I go to bed. But first I need to have dinner, and you need more than one pair of pants, so come with me. My friend owns the men's clothing store downstairs, and I'm hoping she might have something that will fit you. Pants, shirts, underwear even. Oh, and a winter coat. You make me cold just looking at you, wandering around without a shirt. Actually, that shivery feeling she felt every time she stared at his chest had very little to do with cold, but she was hardly going to tell him the truth. He was her protector, as he'd said so many times last night, which sort of made him her employee or subordinate or something, and she knew how wrong it was to molest the people who worked for you. Even if she wasn't paying him or asking him to protect her, or however it worked. So he needed shirts and more pants and a whole lot of underwear. It was dark in the foyer and dark in Taylor's shop. The winter sales racks were right in the back as promised, beside the change rooms and out of view of the street. So even if the cafe patrons were looking for the Mothman tonight, they wouldn't see Tor as he tried on clothes. She thought shirts would be the easiest, so she started with those. Of course, she hadn't considered Tor's wings, which strained at the fabric of even the biggest shirts and stuck out the bottom. She sighed, resigned to staring at his chest muscles and abs for the foreseeable future. Next, she went to the rack of pants, holding each pair up to him until she'd found a few in his size or thereabouts. Then she pushed him into a change room with all the pants in his size and held her breath. She didn't have to wait long. Miss Catena? I seem to have a problem. These pants only have one button on the placket, and I cannot seem to fasten them properly. Would you be kind enough to help me? Sure, she said, ducking behind the curtain. He'd picked a pair of skinny jeans which hugged his butt to perfection, so they were definitely the right size, but the zipper had evidently flummoxed him. Catena dropped to her knees to help, only to find herself with a face full of "We forgot underwear." She'd never raced out of a change room so fast before. Now she knew his size, it was easy to grab a few pairs of boxer briefs off the shelf, and throw a pair into the change room for him to put on. The second time, she managed to avert her eyes from the prominent but well-covered bulge, as she carefully zipped up his pants for him. Then she rose to her feet, stepped back and wow. Shirtless with skinny jeans suited him like he'd been born for them. Broad shoulders and all those muscles tapering down to his abs and a perfectly sculpted whatever it was you called that dip of his hips where the jeans hung. Denim caressed his well-muscled thighs all the way down to his enormous bare feet. Like he'd just rolled out of bed and put them on. Her mouth was dry as stone. Were all gargoyles this sexy, or was Tor just special? All kinds of special. She wanted to jump into his lap and rub herself up against that bulge until... "Miss Kelly, are you all right? You appear to be blushing." Okay, it felt more like her cheeks were on fire, but if he'd been a picture on a calendar, she'd have licked it for sure. "Maybe try some of the other pants on," she suggested. "I'll see if there's anything else that might fit you." She waited long enough to make sure he knew how to unzip his jeans by himself, before she beat a hasty retreat to the rack of shirts she'd dismissed earlier. That's where she found it. A warm, dark winter coat, long enough to hide his wings and with enough space around the shoulders to fit comfortably, even with those wings. Wearing that, he might even be able to walk down the street past the shut-up cafe without anyone recognizing him as the Mothman. When he stepped out of the change room to show her what had to be the most hideous pair of pants known to man, they looked like half of a white tuxedo that had been rolled in newsprint. She wordlessly handed the coat over. "Do men really wear pants like this?" he asked, staring down at the things. "Well, given there's a whole lot of them here on the sale rack, I'm going to go with no on that one. Maybe try something else you do like?" He nodded and headed back behind the curtain. A long moment later, he emerged. He'd picked wool suit pants that matched the coat, and made the jeans look like a mistake. These pants looked like they'd been made for him, perfectly tailored to accentuate the lines of his body, and with the coat thrown over the top, hanging open to reveal a hint of abs, he could have been a mafia boss about to order her to do something outrageous. Just one look at him like this, and she knew she'd do it too. Then he lifted his head and his eyes met hers. There was something vulnerable in them, that didn't belong on such a powerful-looking man. "I feel naked without a shirt and waistcoat," he admitted. "Even if this is the finest coat I've ever worn, it doesn't seem enough." Together they picked out a few shirts, the biggest ones Taylor had. If worst came to worst, they could always cut holes in the back for his wings, as long as he wore the coat over the top. Taylor didn't stock many shoes, but the ones she did have met with Tor's approval, and they fitted, so Catena couldn't complain. And when she saw Tor in his coat with matching pants, shirt and shoes, her breath caught in her throat. His naked self already haunted her dreams, but this, he was every billionaire boss she'd ever lusted after in a book. Only better. "Do I pass inspection?" Tor asked. Catena grinned. It would probably cost her a week's wages, and she'd have to go without wine for a month, but seeing how sexy he looked made it worth every cent. "With flying colors," she said softly. She led the way upstairs to her apartment. If she glanced behind her a few times to reassure herself that Tor really looked as good as she'd thought, and he was coming home with her, well, that was only to be expected. The man was sex on a stick, naked or clothed. Between the wings, the jeans and the suit, Tor could pass for pretty much every romance hero she'd ever read about. All in one incredible package. And yet, when he looked at her like he had in the change room, she sensed there was so much more to him than any character. Hidden depths she doubted even he truly knew about, what with his lack of memories about his past and all. She could help him with that, for that was her calling. The true heart of an archaeologist, unearthing the secrets of the past and bringing them to light in the present. The only question was, which did she want to uncover more, the sexy man or his secrets? She wasn't sure, but she suspected it might be both. Which didn't bode well for her dreams tonight. 25. "Oh, I'm starving. I know you don't eat, but did you want me to warm you up a bowl of pasta, so you can sit and sniff it while I have dinner?" Catena asked. Sitting so close to her wouldn't be wise. Not when he could smell her scent as well as the food. Tor had grown uncomfortably hot in his fine new clothes, and even the memory of her touch as she'd helped him dress was making him hotter still. He needed to get away from her, to cool off. "Thank you, but no. I think I'll go up on the roof instead." Catena glanced out the window. "Are you sure? It's raining. You'll get soaked." Gargoyles don't mind the rain. And it would give him an excuse to take these pants off, which were growing tighter and tighter around his groin, the longer he stayed near her. He dived into the wall, shimmying up through the walls until he reached the roof. He left his clothes on a beam in the ceiling cavity, where they'd stay dry, and ventured out into the open air. A strong breeze gusted across the rooftop again, bringing with it a fine mist of rain and the slightest hint of salt, carried from the sea. Tor breathed deep, throwing his arms wide to embrace the chill. If he'd stayed in the same room as Catena for even a moment longer, he didn't know what he would have done. The ghost of her touch on his skin set his blood boiling in his veins, if he had blood or veins. He did not know. What he did have were wings, which he flapped experimentally, catching the breeze just enough to lift him off his feet, before he drifted back down to the rooftop. Did that mean he could fly? Of course he had no memory of ever doing so, but he'd watched enough birds. If he merely flapped hard enough. He soon found there was more to flight than just flapping. The angle of his body and his wings, that blasted breeze, and once he got himself aloft, there was the problem of landing, without falling flat on his face. It might have been minutes or hours, but finally he managed to fly the length of the roof, then turn around and land on his feet. Triumph surged through him. He'd done it. But it was one thing to skim along a rooftop, and another thing entirely to soar like the sea eagles that nested on a hill overlooking the harbor. Nevertheless, he persisted. Once he managed to get up high enough, the pesky breeze became his friend, buoying up his wings so that he could sail along almost effortlessly. It carried him inland toward a walled compound atop the next hill. Prison. He knew it in his bones, no need to look for signs saying what the place was. It was a place of pain and loneliness. Sounds of the past still echoed in his memories, chilling him more completely than any rain shower. Clinking chains, the whistle and crack of a whip, the scrape of stone as it was pried from the hillside and turned into a terrible place where men were locked away. No, he would not go there tonight. He had escaped, and while he wasn't yet free, one day he would be if he protected Catena. Never mind the lustful feelings he'd had for her. He was in control of his body, and he would not give in to them. He was her protector, and he would protect her from every danger until he was set free. A note of rightness sounded in his head as this thought settled, though he could not explain how he knew what he did, or even how he'd be set free. Only that it would happen if he was true to his purpose. He returned to her house then, landing on the roof, before slipping back between the walls to work on repairing them again. There were some alarming leaks that let in rain, which might not be noticeable now, but would do a great deal of damage later if they were not repaired immediately. So he tucked his wings away and set to work. Inside the house, Catena slept, safe and secure, and he intended to see that she stayed that way. 26. Is that food? It smells like it might be, but I've never seen anyone eat something like that before, Tor said, leaning over the bench to peer at her plate. Catena grinned. This, my gargoyle friend, is a taco. Meat and beans and sauce and salad and salsa with a heap of cheese, all crammed into a crispy corn shell. Messy as all hell to eat, but so worth it. I'd offer you one so you could experience it for yourself, but... Tor forgot about the tacos and headed for the stove, where she'd left the pot of chili con carne. He stuck his head almost in the pot and inhaled. I do not recognize the spices in this dish. I don't imagine chili was a big thing in Scotland when you lived there. Or even here when you arrived. The garlic's pretty much universal though, I think. She frowned. I'm not used to having a house guest I can't cook for. Food is one of those things that brings people together, shared hospitality, that sort of thing. I can't even get you a drink, can I? Tor shook his head. So of all your new clothes, you prefer Maria's old cargo pants, huh? She asked. Tor glanced down. They are practical, sturdy, and have a great many pockets. Suitable attire for doing repairs about the house. She swallowed her first bite of taco. Maybe she'd put in a bit too much chili this time. So that's what you've been doing. I wondered why you weren't in the lounge room watching movies. This is an old house made with substandard materials. The limestone has cracked in places and the plaster too. Or maybe it is simply poor workmanship. Whatever the reason, it will not do. I have repaired what I could, replaced what I could not, and my next task is to patch all the leaks in the roof. Some are only tiny, but once moisture gets in, it tends to spread and can ruin even the best-built house. Catena drained her water glass, then refilled it. Definitely too much chili. Wow. I didn't know your duties as my protector included home maintenance too. You're amazing, Tor. A true treasure. I really should be paying you for this. He waved her offer away, as if it was nothing. I am merely fulfilling my purpose. The fine clothes you purchased yesterday cost more than I could earn in a lifetime. It seems only fitting that I repay you with service. A lifetime of servitude for a couple of pairs of pants, a coat and some accessories? No. That was wrong on so many levels. Look, Tor, I don't know how much you might have earned in the past, but in case you haven't noticed, times have changed. A good bodyguard or protector earns more than I do on a librarian's pay, and tradesmen who do home maintenance earn even more than that, plus materials. I have no problem paying for a few clothes for you, especially when Taylor only charged me half price for them. Now you've patched up a few cracks and helped me out when I needed it, we're more than even. You don't owe me anything. Tor frowned. But I am your protector, bound to serve you. Catena threw her hands in the air. Not by me. Who bound you, Tor? Because I think instead of protecting me, you should be hunting the bastard down and making him set you free. You deserve to be free. Tor nodded. I will be free. But first I must fulfill my purpose and protect you. His frown deepened. Do you not wish for me to protect you? Catena sighed. You're a wish come true, Tor, in more ways than I can count. I wish you'd stay forever, but that's just me being selfish. It is not selfish at all, for I, too, wish to stay and protect you. Therefore I shall stay. Tor. Will you show me how to make the movies show on the screen? She sighed. Trying to explain the evils of slavery was lost on Tor. Maybe a movie would help. Or a TV show. Oh, she had just the right one. Sure, she said. 27. My godmother Maria and I used to watch these all the time. I had a thing for the hunky archaeologist, Daniel Jackson of course, but she preferred Teal'c or O'Neill. She always said she'd never met an archaeologist who loved his wife more than his work, but a warrior, a soldier, who protected his family and his friends. Now he was the sort of person she would have wanted. She'd go all misty-eyed when she said that sometimes, like there had been someone like that, but it hadn't worked out, so she never married. I always wondered, but that's the one story she's never told me. Catena shook her head. So what did you think of Stargate? Tor squinted at the DVD cover in his hands, then back at the menu screen on the TV. I do not understand how it is possible for people to travel to other planets, and for there to be people living on those planets. Of course he'd missed the abolition of slavery storyline, and gone straight to the heart of the show. They travel through a stargate, a sort of passage through space-time that connects 2 points on different planets. She'd heard the characters describe it enough. As long as Tor didn't expect her to explain or even understand wormhole physics. Does such a device truly exist? He demanded. Well, no, not that we know of. Then it is not possible to travel to other planets, or for anyone to live there. Actually, I'm pretty sure they're planning the first manned mission to Mars, and possibly even a colony there. Maybe we should watch The Martian. Preposterous. Men living on Mars. The next thing you'll tell me is that there are men on the moon. I may not know everything about your time, Miss Kelly, but I am not a fool. Catena burst out laughing. The moon landing was more than 50 years ago. I'm sure I can find you a movie or a documentary on that. Men have walked on the moon, and there are tardigrades there too. And there is life on Mars. Just not human life. Yet. I wish you could tell me how long you've slept, so I'd know how much history you've missed. Whoever did this to you deserves a big, fat, prickly cactus up the arse. What is a cactus? What else could she say except, a plant you don't want anywhere near your arse? 28. Persistent beeping echoed down the stairs. That'll be the dryer, Catena said, getting up. Do you want to pick something to watch next, while I go make the bed with the clean linen? Tor nodded, and she trudged upstairs to the laundry to silence the beeping. When she returned, she had a frown on her face. I've been terribly rude. All this time you've been here, and I should have offered you one of the guest rooms to sleep in. I can make one up with fresh linen in a few minutes, if you like. I shudder to think where you've been sleeping. Gargoyles never truly sleep, he assured her. So I thank you for the kind offer, but I have no need for a bed. She perched on the edge of the couch beside him. What, not at all? You don't sleep? What about dreams? Do you have those? In the darkness, before you called me, I was in a sort of wakeful doze. Not awake, but not asleep either, because I was waiting for the call to arms. Afterwards, no, I haven't slept at all. I definitely haven't dreamed. They have been brief. I suppose you would call them flashes of memory from before, but they're nothing like what you'd call a dream. Just memories of sights and sensations, there one moment and gone the next. Not like a dream, where you actually feel like you're there. Her eyes lit up. What do you remember? Tor winced. The bad things mostly. Moments of pain, or where I wish I'd done things differently. I fear my past was not a fit subject for a lady's ears, even a lady scholar like yourself. Her eyes glistened with tears. Sometimes memories hurt so much, it's almost impossible to talk about them. I can't imagine what you must have been through. But if you ever wish to unburden yourself, to talk about it, I'm pretty sure my lady's ears can handle it, and I'd be willing to listen. And if you ever find the man responsible for it, I will happily help you kick his ass. Or at least throw chili powder in his eyes. Then she threw herself at him in what he belatedly realized was a hug. The sweet smell of her hair overwhelmed him as she pressed her face into his chest. He didn't know if he had a heart anymore, but something in there swelled at her touch. It took him a moment to get his arms around her to return the hug, then to pat her awkwardly on the back, before she released him and rose to her feet again, sniffling. So if you don't sleep and you don't dream, what do you do at night? She asked. She laughed a little. Tell me you don't watch over me while I sleep. I mean, it sounds like a sweet, protective sort of thing to do, but it's still kind of creepy. This was firmer ground, much less emotionally fraught. I work on your house mostly, and I keep an eye on the house, knowing you're secure inside. And last night I flew. This came out with considerable pride. He figured he was entitled to it, given how much work it had taken to manage his first flight. Holy hell, you can fly? Her eyes lit up. Will you take me with you? He couldn't refuse her, though he needed more practice before he'd dare to fly with her. As it was, he still wasn't sure he wouldn't fall out of the sky, and he'd never risk her life on his uncertain skills. When the rain clears up, and we have a fine night, I'd be honored to fly with you. Perhaps on the night of the next new moon, he said. Catena beamed. It's a date. Tor had never been happier about not needing to sleep, for he'd need every spare moment to perfect his flying skills between now and then. He would not let her fall. 29. Are you ready, Miss Kelly? No. This was crazy. She was standing on her roof, about to fly around Fremantle with a freaking gargoyle, held up only by the power of his wings. If she fell to her death, she'd deserve it, doing something so stupid. Put your arms around my neck. His arms tightened around her waist, warm and secure. He wasn't going to let go. Am I holding you too tight? She asked breathlessly. I'm made of stone. No matter how tight your hold, you can't choke me, for I don't need to breathe. Now hold on tight, for up we go. His wings spread wide, beating the air once, twice, 3 times before her feet left the roof. A little higher and we can catch an updraft. The wind will do the work for us. 1 beat. Another. Ready? Here we go. Catena tried to look at the view as they soared upward, but the rush of wind from his wings stung, forcing her to close her eyes. As if he could feel her discomfort, Tor said, Don't worry, you're safe in my arms. I won't let you go until we're safe on the ground again. Shit. Him landing in the middle of High Street, with her in his arms, in front of a cafe full of people with camera phones. Catena's stomach swooped, threatening to bring her dinner back up again. She swallowed. On the roof. We'll be landing on the roof. Wherever you wish, when you wish. Now if you want to stop. He tilted and turned, and suddenly the wind wasn't in her face anymore. Maybe it hadn't been his wings to blame at all, but the weather trying to spoil their flight. No, I've always liked flying, she said. She felt him stiffen in surprise. You've flown before? Catena laughed. Of course. In a plane. I'm sure you've seen them, flashing lights on their wingtips, high up in the sky? Higher than you can fly? Another mystery I had meant to ask you about. Thank you. His wings flapped, but they seemed to have stopped moving. Where would you like to go? She took a deep breath. Wherever you'd like to take me. Show me a view you wish to share. 1. In Catena's perfect world, myths and legends would all be true. Somewhere out there, a fated mate was destined to find her. Men in power were capable of making good decisions that benefited more people than just themselves, and her research supervisor would actually tell her what to do for once, instead of magically expecting her to be able to pick the perfect PhD project. But her world wasn't perfect. Not yet, anyway. Professor Bishop spread his hands wide. The choice is yours, Catena. What sort of research project do you want to spend the next 3 years studying? Catena wished she could sink through the floor before the professor shouted at her for the reply she had to make. I don't know. What options are there? It wasn't like she could just pick anything. Archaeology wasn't exactly cheap. She had to pick a project where there was funding and a dig already planned. Well, there are a lot here in Western Australia at the moment. It's a good year for government funding. Fremantle Prison has 2 projects on the cards for the near future, the hospital and the commissariat. You could start your project before summer does. Or there's the East Perth Cemetery excavation for the new development. Or you could... He continued, but Catena's mind drifted. None of them really appealed to her. Worse, whatever she picked, she'd be branded an expert in that for the rest of her life. So it wouldn't just be 3 years of boredom on a project she had no interest in, it'd be a lifetime of dullness, digging things up she didn't care about. Not to mention she'd become an archaeologist because she'd grown up hearing all the stories about Maria's adventures around the world. Catena wanted to have her own adventures. Stories she could tell Maria about. Professor Bishop had evidently noticed her distraction. What about Aboriginal heritage? There are a number of rock art projects. Catena shook her head. Her family had migrated to Australia. It didn't feel right to be digging up Indigenous heritage dating back 50,000 years or more, when her family hadn't been in the country for more than a few generations. Maritime archaeology? There's a team starting to map Indigenous settlements on the seafloor, from before the sea level rise up in the Pilbara. Big budget for that one, with resource industry funding. I don't have my dive ticket, Catena said. Before the professor could remind her that she could have her scuba diving certificate in a matter of days, she added, and I'm scared of sharks. Professor Bishop frowned. So you probably won't be interested in the new Abrolhos study then. Cataloguing shipwrecks, oh wait. There's a land one in here, looking at the Batavia sites on one of the islands. No sharks there unless you go in the water. Wasn't that the island where a bunch of shipwreck survivors went mad and killed each other over food and water? She'd heard the place was as cursed as Tutankhamun's tomb. Then again, it wasn't like Catena believed in curses or the supernatural, so... maybe. It looks like that one doesn't have funding yet, still waiting on budget approval. Still, it's worth considering, so I'll leave it on the list. I'll send it through to your email, so you can have a better look before you decide. You've only got a month until the proposal deadline and you don't want to miss it, or you won't be able to get a scholarship. Not everyone gets one, you know. Competition is fierce, and the selection panel only approves the projects they think tick all the boxes best. And even if you do get a scholarship, only a quarter of PhD students actually finish their project on time and graduate. So it's important that you pick the right project for the selection board and the right project for you, so you'll finish it. Catena nodded, even as her tummy clenched into a terrified little ball. She had less than 4 weeks to make the most important decision of her life. And write a proposal that would convince the scholarships board to pay for it. Or she could stay an assistant librarian for the rest of her life. Which wasn't bad, but it was hardly an adventure. "I will have my proposal ready on time, Professor. I promise." And she would, because the last thing she wanted was for him to shout at her for not doing it. Or for anything really. Professor Bishop's volatile temper rarely remained calm for more than 10 minutes at a time. In fact, it was a miracle she'd managed to get through this meeting without him getting angry at something. Better not push her luck. She rose to leave. "See that he broke off as his phone emitted a sound like a police siren. He glared at it, then snatched it up and shouted, "You're not supposed to contact me. My lawyer gave you strict instructions." Catena fled out of the office and down the hall, but even outside she could still hear the professor shouting at his soon-to-be ex-wife about the disposal of their joint property investments. Half the campus probably knew about Professor Bishop's pending divorce by now, and if they were anything like Catena, they also hoped the matter was sorted and settled as quickly as possible. She only wished choosing a PhD project could be as simple. 2. Tor opened his eyes to darkness. Then he heard it again, the familiar scrape of stone on stone before it was lifted. Exultation flooded through him. Finally it was time. He would rise and answer the call. A scratchy voice echoed from deep in his memories, "When I have need of you, I will call, and you shall come. You will protect her and everything else I hold dear, for that is your purpose. Do you understand? When I call, you will answer." But the call did not come. Instead, a deep, bone-jarring vibration rumbled through earth and stone and Tor, rattling his very teeth in his head. He was not aware of its ending. Only that he could hear familiar sounds, the rhythmic beat of steel on stone, the clatter of cartwheels, the shouts of men, the crunch of stone surrendering to the superior force of a man, before the very ground started shaking once more. It must be the middle of the workday, with so much activity about. No wonder the call hadn't yet come, for he could not answer as long as the sun was in the sky. At night he would hear the call. And he would answer as he must. For why else had he been awakened, if not to rise and serve his purpose? Soon the sun would sink beneath the horizon and Tor would rise. In the meantime Tor closed his eyes. 3. "If you could just shelve those last few returns, you're good to go," Lillian said, gesturing toward the bin under the return chute. The brimming bin. Catena sighed. She'd already emptied it twice, but today seemed to be the day every student had decided to return an entire semester's worth of loans, all in one hit. Exams must have started. Then again, shelving books was easier than dealing with panicked students at the help desk, who all wanted to shout at you if you couldn't magically produce the book they needed for today's exam. Never mind that they'd had all semester to borrow it, and now it was out on loan, they expected you to work miracles. Sure. Scanning the books into the system so the catalog would know they were returned took only a few minutes, but returning them took much longer, so that by the time Catena left the library and headed for home, it was already late afternoon and the sun was sinking fast. Winter definitely wasn't her favorite time of year. Luckily she lived close enough to walk home from work, and, luckier still, her street was still closed to car traffic because they were digging up the road to replace the water pipes. So where yesterday there had been a road, now there was a fenced-off dark ditch that stretched all the way down the street, stopping in front of her house. The excavator responsible for the chasm sat proudly beside it, within its fenced-off enclosure, as though if it were uncaged it would eagerly begin digging again, extending the trench to the next intersection. Catena hoped no one would release the beast until she was awake, or, better yet, at work on Monday. Through the door, up the stairs to the landing above the ground-floor shops, one more door to unlock, and she was home. Catena let her bag thud to the floor, too tired to carry it further than the entry. She could pick it up later. Fighting off panic at choosing her future research project and working fried her brain worse than doing multiple concurrent joint projects during her undergrad degree. Or maybe it was just manhandling so many books around the library today. She should be making dinner, but what she wanted was a hot chocolate. Opening the fridge, she reached for the milk that wasn't there. Shit. She knew she was supposed to pick something up on her way home, but, like so much lately, she'd forgotten. She glanced at the darkened windows. Surely she could wait until morning. But she'd need milk for breakfast, because she didn't do dry cereal. Or she could have toast. Nope. No bread either. Better add that to the list. Now she had to go to the supermarket. Luckily, it was still open. Judging by the slow-moving denizens in Coles, not unlike some of the mythical monsters she read about when she had time, she wasn't the only one who'd had an exhausting week. But she had every intention of escaping these zombies and having her hot chocolate, sooner rather than later. And with chocolate biscuits, she decided, snagging a pack of Tim Tams from the specials rack at the end of the aisle. Seeing as she was here, she should probably buy something suitable for dinner. Something she could just whack in the oven to cook while she collapsed on the couch. Even better if there'd be leftovers for tomorrow. Catena lugged her shopping basket to the cash register, and was soon swinging her fully laden shopping bags as she headed home. Why weren't the streetlights lit yet? She could barely see her feet in front of her, let alone where the footpath ended and the road began. Not to mention what lurked in the shadows between the shop fronts. She quickened her steps, offering a prayer to whatever deity would listen that she'd make it home safely. Which was probably about as helpful as hoping some mythical monster would save her, should she get into trouble. Or a good-looking monster hunter. She smothered a laugh. Maybe when she got home she should watch. She stumbled over something in the dark, pitching forward, but she managed to regain her balance instead of face-planting on the footpath. Hoping no one had seen her tripping over her own feet, Catena kept going. A shout erupted behind her. Hey! What do you think you're doing? You broke my guitar case and, did you just take my money? She glanced over her shoulder just long enough to see someone rise from where they'd been sitting on the ground, before she tucked her head down and bolted for home. Oi! You! Stop! You'd better pay for that. A woman alone, stopping at the order of an angry man in the dark? Catena wasn't stupid. Instead she ran faster. This time, when she prayed to whatever deity would listen, she had only one wish, for help. Just a little bit further and she'd be safely home. 6 more shops. 5. 4. 3. She looked up, her eyes straining to see the door in the dark. She almost didn't see the huge shadow beside it until it was too late. Easily twice as wide as she was, and so tall his head brushed against the shop sign suspended from the roof above. And when he stretched his arms out, his fingers surely touched the shop window on one side, and the construction site fencing on the other. No escape. No way past and no way back. If she could only get her keys out in time, unlock the door and slam it behind her. The keys. Where were her keys? Strong arms wrapped around her, pressing her against a chest as warm and hard as sun-soaked stone. He whirled her around, spinning a tight circle that only seemed to squeeze her harder, smother her, until she could no longer breathe, and blackness took her. 4. When the call came, it was not the sour, scratchy voice that Tor expected. Nor had he expected the call to come from a woman. Someone help me. Please. It was the barest, breathless whisper, but Tor heard it, for he was waiting. He shot through earth and stone, surfacing on a street that he neither knew nor recognized, but he cared nothing for the street. No, all his attention was on her, for the clarion call came from her lips as she flew toward him, as if her feet bore wings. Tor grinned. Her pursuer, the reason for her panic, approached. How dare he even consider harming her? Tor rose to his fullest height, his widest stance, the better to protect her. He swelled until he filled all the available space between the fence and the shopfront, so the pursuer could not pass. What did she want him to do? Tor listened hard, for her voice was still the softest whisper. Please let me get inside, she repeated. Her eyes darted from him to the door and back again. Tor bowed his head in acquiescence as she ran straight into his embrace. His arms closed around her, followed by his wings. Never had he held anything more precious than her trembling form, and he would protect her with every part of him. Her pursuer skidded to a stop, the whites of his eyes wide with satisfying fear. Begone! Tor growled. The pursuer nearly dropped his guitar in his haste to turn and run away, back the way he'd come. A strange choice of weapon, to be sure. What manner of man wielded a guitar when attacking a woman? If he was some sort of musician, surely he would not risk the tool of his trade so. Then again, he was a fool for daring to chase her in the first place, when she had such a powerful protector. Ah, but perhaps he had not known? The musician, if that's what he was no longer in sight. Only then did Tor remember her second command: she wanted to be inside the building. He held tight to her as he threw his body at the wall, passing through it as easily as he'd traveled through stone to the street. He felt her slump in his arms. She must be a gentle lady indeed, to swoon. He'd best find her a bed or at least a couch to lie on until she awoke. Though there were shops below, on the upper floors were bedchambers. Only one had books upon the table beside the bed, and clothes laid on the chair in the corner. This must be her bedchamber, where she slept. Tor unfurled his wings so that he might carry her to bed. Her scent seemed to fill the very air between them, winding its sweet floral fragrance about him as securely as any spell. He didn't want to let her go. She gave a little sigh as if she shared the sentiment. But sentiment was all it could ever be. I am your protector. It is my duty to keep you safe, he said as he laid her on the bed. He tugged off her shoes, then covered her with the eiderdown. The cloth had a strange design upon it, pyramid structures on sand, with a starry sky behind them, as lifelike as though they were real. Like a landscape painting some lord might hang on his library wall. Hardly something to decorate a lady's bedchamber. Then again, few ladies warranted an immortal protector, so she must be an unusual lady. Triumph welled in Tor's breast. He'd successfully protected her. Maybe not perfectly, but he'd gotten her home safe. He hoped she would see it so. If she rejected his service, she might command him to go back to sleep, never to wake again. He would have failed. But he had not failed. He would tell her so, and pray he did not offend her in doing so. It's all right, miss. You're safe, he said softly into the darkness. Rustling from the bed told her she was awake. She stared at him for a long moment, before squeezing her eyes shut. Her whispered words carried to him, please be gone, please be gone, please be gone. If that was her command, then he would be obedient to her wishes. Tor faded into the wall, becoming one with the stone. He watched and waited for further commands, but she was strangely silent. She stared searchingly around her bedchamber, as if she did not trust Tor to have done as she asked. You're safe, he said from the wall. It's all right, miss, you're safe. She gave a little nod, as if she heard him and approved, before she settled down on her pillows and drifted off to sleep. 5. Catena woke in darkness, but there was enough light coming through the window to see that she was definitely in her bedroom. Perhaps she dreamed it all, the trip to the supermarket full of zombies, being chased home, and the hulking monster lurking outside her front door. Okay, put like that, she definitely dreamed it all up. It sounded like a mashup of several supernatural episodes, with extra zombies thrown in for spice. She should probably watch less TV for a while if her imagination was conjuring up such craziness when she slept. She must have come upstairs, decided to lie on the bed for just a moment, and fallen asleep. Wouldn't be the first time. It's all right, miss. You're safe. Catena froze. The voice was male and definitely in the room with her. If there was a man in her bedroom, then no matter what words he said, she was anything but safe. There. A shadow in the corner, behind the door. Just as huge as the one she'd seen outside before he grabbed her. He lunged forward, then stopped in a sort of half-crouch that she realized was a bow, before he lifted his head to look right at her. Moonlight darted through the window and wreathed his face, silvering his dark hair. Yet when his eyes met hers, dark pools in the shadows of his face, something passed between them. It felt like understanding. Understanding that she'd imagined a man in her bedroom. She must be going mad. Catena closed her eyes. When she opened them, she'd see that there was no one else in her room, and he'd be gone. Please be gone. Her eyes popped open and she flicked on the bedside light. See. The corner was empty, with no shadows to be seen. She turned the light off, then snuggled back down under the quilt. The most sensible thing to do in this situation was to go back to sleep. She evidently needed it if she was hallucinating strange men in her bedroom. You're safe. See. Even her hallucinations agreed with her. Catena snuggled under the quilt, mumbling his words over and over to herself as she drifted back to sleep. 6. Work hard and one day you'll earn your freedom. Do as you're told and one day you'll be your own man again. Protect her and the property. The words swirled in Tor's head, punctuated by the clink of chains, faint memories that were all he knew of his past. Obey or he'd wear chains again. They'd lock him up forever and never let him out. But not if he protected her. Those were his orders, orders he wanted to obey. And maybe, just maybe, if he could please her, then she would set him free just like they'd promised. Because while he did not trust the voices in his memory, hers was not one of them. Instead, she was his future. A future where he swore he would keep her safe. 7. Between the sunlight streaming through her window, why hadn't she closed the curtains last night, and whatever it was digging painfully into her thigh, Catena was forced to give up on sleep. Sunbeams lit up the corner behind the door, chasing away any hope of a shadow, menacing or otherwise. Definitely a dream. Catena made her way to the bathroom, then stopped dead at the sight of her reflection. She hadn't slept in her clothes since, whenever the last time she'd come home drunk from some undergrad party, probably back in first year. Shit, she was still wearing her coat with yep, her keys, wallet and phone in the pockets. The keys were what had woken her up. She knew she'd been tired, but surely not so tired that she'd forgotten to take her coat off in the house. Could it have been real? No. It couldn't have been. Because, if it had, then there'd been a man in her bedroom last night. She rushed back to her room, checking in the cupboard, under the bed, anywhere that a creature as big as a cat might hide. She breathed a sigh of relief when no man materialized, only to trip over something on the floor where nothing should be. Her shoes beside 2 shopping bags. It couldn't be. And yet, she had to get the milk into the fridge before it soured. Not to mention all the other things she'd bought. Seizing the bags, Catena raced downstairs to the kitchen, then busied herself making sure everything went where it belonged. Creating order from chaos, everything in its place, just like in the library. By the time she closed the pantry door on the last pack of Tim Tams, Catena was pretty sure she'd figured out what really happened last night. She'd gone to the supermarket, been chased by a busker, brought her stuff home, and been so exhausted from running all that way that she'd gone straight up to bed and zonked out for the night. Then she'd had a bad dream, imagining there was someone in her room, woken up in fright only to find out she was alone, and gone back to sleep. Yes. It all fitted, all made sense. That long dark hair, those eyes that had mesmerized her, those strong arms that had wrapped around her had all been figments of her overactive imagination. And the remedy? She wasn't going to watch or read anything out of the ordinary until Monday. No werewolf fated mates romances, no Monster Hunter TV shows, no superheroes, no science fiction, nothing but contemporary romance and documentaries until Monday. Besides, she had her PhD project proposal to do. There was enough realistic reading to do on that to keep her busy all weekend. In fact, Catena grabbed a packet of Tim Tams out of the pantry, wishing she'd bought more. She considered heading back to the supermarket, but the thought of the angry busker out there, who might still be waiting for her, was enough to keep her inside for the foreseeable future. 8. Catena considered calling her parents and telling them she was sick, to get out of her weekly visit, so she wouldn't have to go outside her house and maybe see the mad busker again. But she was woefully low on food, and her mother had promised to make cannoli, which Catena couldn't resist, so the clock in her parents' lounge room was just chiming 12 when she stepped inside. It smelled like roast, but Catena had no doubt that it would be accompanied by some Sicilian foods that her father would insist didn't belong on the same table as a traditional roast. It had been an ongoing argument between her parents for as long as she could remember, but as long as he got his roast potatoes and gravy, Dad usually didn't do more than grumble a bit anymore. "Is that you, Cat? Can you come help me serve up?" Mum called. That was code for Mum needing to tell her something without her father or brother hearing. Catena hoped it wasn't because Dad had had another health scare. If the doctor had ordered him to change his diet so that he couldn't eat something he loved, Dad would be impossible at lunch. Luckily for once, Dad's health was fine. "Your dad's been taking his pills and his last batch of blood tests were good, so the doctor said he's allowed to eat normally again. Your dad decided he wanted some roast recipe he saw on some TV cooking show." If there was one thing Mum hated, it was being told how to cook. Catena winced. Mum only smiled. "I told him I'm too old to be learning to cook new things, especially dipping potatoes in duck fat or some such thing, so if your father wants to eat some recipe he saw on TV, then he must cook it himself." Catena choked. "So, your father has made today's roast, and I want you to make sure you say nice things about it. If it's terrible, don't look at me. I have a big pan of eggplant parmesan almost ready, in case you can't eat any of his things." "And cannoli?" Catena asked. "Of course. I promised. What with your dad doing most of the work for lunch, I had time to make enough for lunch and a box for you to take home. Enough to last you all week." 2 days if she was lucky, Catena thought but didn't say. Best her mother didn't know about her bad eating habits. If she knew she'd had a pack of Tim Tams for breakfast yesterday, or that she'd been chased down the street by an angry busker, Mum wouldn't let her leave after lunch. She'd insist Catena move back home, into her old bedroom with its pink swathed single bed, as if she was still a child and not a grown woman about to start her PhD. Well, if she got the proposal in on time and actually picked a project. "So thanks, Mum," was all she said, before grabbing a drink from the fridge and heading for the dining room, where she could hear her father and brother in the middle of a heated discussion about something. The oven timer shrilled, drowning them both out. "That's for you, Seamus." Dad broke off and came toward the kitchen, kissing Catena's cheek on the way. "Good to see you, Cat. You're right on time." Catena took a seat across from her brother, who was now intent on the screen of his phone. "How's things, Archie? You headed back up to the Minnesite tomorrow?" Archie didn't even glance up. "Tuesday, actually. My rotation changeover is on Tuesday. Then 2 weeks on site before I can come home again. Catena knew it paid well, but she couldn't imagine working such long hours, so far away from everyone and everything. She suspected he liked it as little as she would, but the last time she'd asked him, he'd snapped that it paid better than archaeology, which she had to admit was true. But there was more to life than work and money. With a lot more of Mum's help than Dad would ever dare admit to, he finally managed to get lunch on the table, and it wasn't anywhere near as bad as it might have been. Dad had followed the recipe to the letter, which had resulted in a slightly singed roast beef that was at least cooked on the inside, and a mountain of surprisingly tasty potatoes. Catena gave compliments where they were due, did due justice to her mother's eggplant parmesan, and barely managed to find space for some of the cannoli before she was too full to move. She silently thanked her mother's foresight for offering her a box to take home. She was just carrying the first armload of plates to the dishwasher when it started. "What do you think about this zero-emissions target thing?" "Sounds like a terrible thing for the economy," Dad said, cracking open another beer. "Only if you're a dinosaur like those fossils over in Canberra, who think the economy will collapse if it's not running on coal, like we're still in Victorian times or something," Archie snapped. "Well, they nix that carbon tax fast enough. If power bills go up, no one will be able to pay for it, and that'll make the economy collapse. Businesses will go broke." "No, they won't, Dad. Businesses, especially the biggest players like the mining industry, have been planning for this for decades. Hybrid cars, solar farms, wind, batteries, not to mention mining all the right materials needed to make those things. They don't want to be left behind, even if the government is living in last century. Even you're ahead of them, Dad, you've got solar panels on the roof." "Yeah, but are solar panels any good? We only got them because a guy at work knew someone who was doing cheap installation. And the wiring only lasts a few years, which isn't covered by the warranty, so we had to get someone up there last week to replace it all. What's the point of getting solar panels if they're just going to break?" "Dad, it's not the panels, it's your dodgy installer who's to blame. If you'd gone with the company I told you to." As the volume increased on the shouting match between them, Catena tucked the box of cannoli under her arm, waved her free hand in farewell, and headed for the door. 9. Maria's nursing home was on her way home. They wouldn't mind if she arrived early. Catena checked the time, visiting hours had just begun. Perfect. Her godmother was lying in her bed, watching a cooking show, when Catena reached her room. Catena wondered if it was the same one her dad had pulled the roast recipe from. Catena didn't bother knocking. "Hi, Maria. Mum made cannoli and I thought you might like some." She brandished the box. Maria glanced up, squinting at Catena's face for a moment. Catena waited, wondering if she'd recognize her today. "My goddaughter likes cannoli. Did I ever show you a photo of her?" Maria asked, lifting the remote to turn off the TV show. Catena sighed inwardly but summoned a smile. "I'm not sure. What's her name?" Maria pointed at a photo on the wall beside her bed. "That's her. Catena. Her parents wanted her brought up all Catholic like they were, but she's too curious to stick to such a narrow view of the world. She'll be an archaeologist, like me, just you wait and see." Catena longed to remind Maria that she was already an archaeologist, finished her honors degree and about to take the next step, but it wasn't Maria's fault she didn't remember. Alzheimer's had stolen her memories from her, and reminding Maria of that fact only resulted in the most creative slew of curses Catena had ever heard, spanning at least 6 languages, some of them legally dead, and bringing complaints from all over the nursing home at the words the residents did understand. Because when you could swear in over a dozen languages, you could offend everybody. "What makes you say that?" Catena asked instead. Maria might not remember who she was now, but sometimes she had crystal clear recollection of their time together when she was little. She listened to all my stories, every dig I've ever been on. Egypt, Pompeii, Rome, Turkey, that time I made it to Russia. Maria smiled. And when she's old enough, I'll see she's all set up too. I've left her everything in my will. The house, all of it. She'll have someone to look out for her too. I mean she will? Who? Maria winked. The gargoyle, that's who. He's more valuable than anything inside the house, for he'll be her defender. He'll make sure nothing bad happens to her. The statue on the roof. Catena sighed. Here she'd been hoping that maybe Maria had spoken to some of her old colleagues, someone who might offer her more options for her research than Professor Bishop could. Now where's that cannoli? Maria asked. Catena sat down beside her and opened the box. Did I ever tell you about the time? Maria had, for Catena had heard all her stories, but she never tired of them, so she settled down to listen. 10. When the nurses shooed her out of Maria's room and back home, the winter sun enticed Catena out onto the roof on Sunday afternoon, with her laptop and a fresh packet of Tim Tams to go with her cup of coffee. By the time the biscuits were gone, she'd run through Professor Bishop's project list twice, and she was still no closer to picking one. She wished she could have talked it over with her family, Maria, or even one of her friends, but none of them would understand. Well, Sybil would if she weren't working some ice dig up near the Arctic Circle, where the phone and internet access was next to non-existent. The last time she'd called, there'd been so much static, Catena had barely understood any of what she was saying. Of the ones who were still here, only Alethea intended to go on to do her PhD, and she'd already had her project picked for her, that cemetery dig her company had won a project for. They were paying her to do the actual site excavation, so she'd be crazy not to choose that one. But Catena worked in a library, not a heritage consulting company, so getting her employer to make the decision for her wasn't an option. Truly, she just wanted someone to tell her what to do, make the decision for her. It could be anyone, just as long as she didn't have to be the one to do it. Well, it should be someone who knew her, and something about the projects, and what would suit her. What do you think? She asked the gargoyle that sat on the edge of the roof. He'd been there since the place was built, her godmother had told her, when she still lived in this apartment, before she'd gone into a nursing home. He knew all the building's secrets, and he'd heard hers since she'd been old enough to talk. It wasn't quite the same as telling him she didn't like peas, or that she'd bitten the first boy she kissed, so he'd gone off wailing to his mother, but she knew he'd never told anyone her secrets, because her godmother had told her gargoyles were protectors, fiercely loyal to those under their care. Plus, he never left his eyrie at the top of the building. On the day she'd helped Maria pack her things for the nursing home, Maria had pointed at the gargoyle and said that his job was to protect Catena now, because the apartment was hers. Catena had put it down to Maria's advancing dementia at the time, but it hadn't stopped her talking to the gargoyle. One day she might get a cat, like her neighbor, but she didn't feel responsible enough to be a pet owner. She struggled to keep Maria's plants alive as it was. The gargoyle just sat there, looking thoughtful, like he was patiently waiting for her to continue. Well, she should probably give him all the facts. Even just talking about them aloud might help. The interstate and overseas ones I can pretty much cross off the list right away. It's not like I can afford to travel, or live in another city for a while. Even the ones in Western Australia that are too far to drive to, I can't really do. Anything further than Geraldton or Albany, really. I mean, any of the Pilbara projects are a 2-day drive, and it's not like I own a 4-wheel drive, which is pretty much what you need out there. So, there are 3 sites on the list I could probably get to. The Abrolhos dig with the Maritime Museum, the Fremantle Prison projects, or the cemetery in East Perth. Well, assuming the Abrolhos one goes ahead, I should be able to drive up to Geraldton, and the Maritime Museum team will surely have a boat, so I could even sleep on deck if I have to. The artifacts will come back to the shipwreck galleries, which is only up the road from here, so it's not like I'd have to stay in Geraldton or out on the islands, and I have heard it's beautiful up there. She'd also heard the sharks were massive. 6 or 7 meters long, big enough to eat her in one gulp. As long as I stay out of the water, the sharks should leave me alone. Not that they'd left the shipwreck survivors alone. According to some of the accounts she'd read, a lot of the survivors ended up eaten by sharks, which was why there were so few bodies buried on the islands. I've heard the stories though. No one wants to sleep on the island because it's haunted. What with all the people who got killed and the ones who went mad and did the killing, and then the torture and executions after. Catena swallowed. The Batavia story was probably one of the most gruesome in West Australian history, and it happened a full 2 centuries before the Swan River colony was even settled. I'm not sure how I'd go if we dug up bodies. I mean, if they were murdered or executed or whatever. I'd have to reread all the translations of the trials and everything, to be able to quote them in my thesis. Yeah, maybe the Abrolhos one was a bad idea. Then there's the East Perth Cemetery. Alethea's already working on that one, so I'd know someone. But she'll be doing her PhD on what she finds there too, and there might not be enough material for 2 research projects. It really depends what's in the cemetery. Well, bodies of course, which have been buried a while. I mean, the Abrolhos bodies are all skeletons by now, but East Perth Cemetery was still in use a century ago, or at least I think so the bodies might still be, decaying. Or not decaying, depending on how they were buried. Who was she kidding? She didn't want to dig up bodies, at the Abrolhos or in a cemetery. She let out a shaky laugh. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. 4 years from now, do I want to be introducing myself as Dr. Catena Kelly, expert in exhuming bodies? Worse, do I want to continue digging up dead people for the rest of my career? The gargoyle of course kept his counsel. Which leaves the prison projects. They're local, just up the hill from here. She turned and pointed. They have their own museum collection on site, so any artifacts we find would stay there, so I'd have no problems accessing them. Both projects are fully funded, so they'll definitely go ahead. Plus there's more chance of finding something of significance, because the same buildings have been there all this time. The location's perfect, really it is, it's just that, every time I've been up there on a school trip or whatever, I've just gotten this really bad feeling. I mean, it's a prison. Built by convicts who'd have to live inside it, then made into a maximum security prison filled with rapists and serial killers and people who did such bad things they were hanged for their crimes. The gallows is still there, with a rope and a trapdoor and everything. I could barely stand to stay there for the tours. To have to go there every day to work and dig stuff up, in places where those people spent their days. Some of them are still alive and still in prison but transferred to Casuarina when Fremantle closed. People so bad, they've been in prison for longer than I've been alive. She'd heard the place was haunted too, almost as badly as the Abrolhos. What sort of place was Perth where the cemetery was the least haunted site on her list? Anyway, so those are really the only 3 options unless something else magically comes up, which is unlikely. So what do you think? She waited barely a moment, before putting her hand up and patting the sun-warmed statue. No, don't tell me now. It's a lot to take in. We should probably both sleep on it, and you can tell me in the morning. She gave the statue one last pat, wondering at the warmth under her hand, almost as though the statue was a living thing and not just carved stone, silent and watchful until centuries of weather ground it down to sand. If only it could talk, to tell her all the things it had seen from its eyrie up here. Catena laughed and shook her head, then headed downstairs to the kitchen to start dinner. Maybe the answer would come to her while she was cooking. 11. Tor followed her to the roof, which he was surprised to find furnished like one of the sitting rooms inside the house, with sofas and tables and chairs. She curled up in one of the sofas, with her book-like device that magically showed different pictures at her command. The best vantage point was a stone statue that faced the front of the building, which seemed to be watching the street below. Tor slipped inside the creature, staring out the back of its head at her instead. At first she ignored him, as was her custom. He was her servant, far beneath her notice, unless she wanted him to do something. But she hadn't given him a single order since the first night she'd called him into her service. Perhaps she had no further use for him, and meant to send him back to the darkness from whence he came. If such was her wish, then surely he would feel some pull towards it, like the irresistible compulsion that had brought him to defend her in her moment of need. Yet the only pull he felt now was toward her. He didn't want to return to his deathless sleep, waiting for a call that might never come. He wanted. "What do you think?" Wait, was she speaking to him? She seemed to be staring right at him, as though she could see him hiding in the statue. Before he could collect his scattered wits to be able to answer her, she began to explain. She was a scholar, he discovered, with extensive knowledge of history and medicine, or at least the human body. She abhorred violence, for when the very thought of it touched her delicate sensibilities, she shuddered as though a hand had been raised to harm her own person and not some long-dead victim in the past. She was gently born, with a soft but well-spoken voice he could happily listen to all day. And while she habitually dresses in men's trousers, a fashion Tor had never heard of before, she wasn't the only one. He could see several other women in the street below wearing the same sort of garb, though there were those who wore skirts too. Perhaps this was the expected attire for a female scholar. He would not know, he'd never met one before. The more she spoke, the more Tor became certain that he'd never met anyone quite like Miss Catena Kelly. Even her name sounded like the harmonious rhythm of a chisel chiming on stone. "So what do you think?" she asked again. For the second time his tongue tangled up on him again, with his head a confusion of thoughts as to what he should and shouldn't say, and whether she would permit him to address her by name, like he wanted to, or that a learned scholar like her would actually want to hear the thoughts of someone as uneducated as him. Then her hand landed on the statue's head, and he lost all coherent thought altogether. He strained to reach her through the thin layer of stone that held them apart. The statue bathed in afternoon sunlight, which he dared not touch, unless he wanted to be stuck as this statue's twin until sunset. Then how would he answer her? "No, don't tell me now. Tell me in the morning," she said, as if reading his thoughts. Perhaps she could, for if she could see him invisible inside the statue, then it was only a mite further to reach the thoughts inside his head. He would have to guard those too. One last wistful pat that Tor wished he could feel with all his being, before she headed inside. Only when she'd left did pride swell within his chest. She'd given him an order. One he had no idea how he would fulfill, for he'd scarcely understood half of what she'd said, but he would do his best. While she slept, for he did not, he would gather his scattered thoughts and try to find the words to convey them to her, in any way that might help. For if he could help her now, she might have other commands for him, so that he might remain at her side, watching over her instead of being sent back into the dark. And he wanted to stay more than anything. 12. For the second evening in a row, Tor watched Miss Kelly from the walls of her home. He half hoped she'd give him a new command and rescind the last one, but she retired to sleep without addressing a single word to him, so he was left with the same order, and no idea what to say. He wanted to give her good advice. He also needed to be honest, for a woman who could read his mind could surely spot a lie. Then again, was it not foolish to ask for advice on choosing one's life path from a man who had no memory of his own path or any choice in it, and who knew even less about her past or the future she might wish to shape? He was her protector, not her advisor. When he was sure she was safely asleep, Tor ascended to the rooftop, to pace it like a man driven mad with too many thoughts in his head. Over and over, he repeated what she'd told him in his head. The island, the cemetery, or the prison? Which should she wish to study most? And what, oh horror of horrors, did he think? The faint streaks of dawn lightened the sky, and he still had nothing to say. Worse still, if Miss Kelly, infinitely more clever than he, could not make a choice, then how could he? Then again, the worst she could do was send him back to the darkness. If he did not have the courage to answer her command, then he may as well return from whence he came. If darkness would be his fate, whatever he chose, then he would at least not go as a coward. Tor traveled to the wall of her bedchamber. He considered staying within the walls so that all she would hear was his voice as he had last night, but she deserved more than that. Besides, if she could see him hiding in the walls, then there was no hiding from her anyway. Tor stepped out of the plaster in the corner of her room, as far from the windows as he could get. He wrapped his wings about himself and ducked his head, in the deepest bow of respect he could manage. Miss Kelly, please forgive the lateness of my answer, but it is still morning, so I will venture to obey your command. You asked me to tell you what I think, and I? His voice had died on him. Hell and damnation and that snotty superintendent's shriveled left testicle. Tor cleared his throat and tried again. Miss Kelly, I think that you are far wiser than I shall ever be, and no one else is better placed than your own self to make important decisions about your future and happiness. My only desire is to see you safe and happy, and I will do everything within my power to help you to be both of those things. If there is anything I can do, you have but to ask, and it shall be done. But I think you know your own heart, and the island, the cemetery and the prison will not be enough to satisfy you, which is why you look elsewhere. It is my sincere hope that a new path may open its way to you, and that you will permit me to continue protecting you as you venture upon your chosen road. Tor glanced up. Sunlight was already creeping through the curtains. He only had but a moment. I am honored to be at your service, he said, before he was forced to flee. 13. Sleep did not come easy to Catena that night, and she woke before dawn, convinced the gargoyle had come down from the roof and was crouched in the corner of her bedroom talking to her. He'd said something about none of the projects being enough for her, and how he was honored to be of service. She wished she could ask him to repeat it all, for it had sounded so flowery, but the corner where she'd thought he'd sat was empty now, lit by a stray ray of light from the rising sun. There wasn't a gargoyle in her room, he was firmly stuck to the roof, where he belonged. Once she'd had breakfast and a lot of coffee, then she could go up there and ask him to repeat himself, and feel like an idiot for dreaming about roof ornaments that talked. Next thing she knew, she'd be talking to garden gnomes. Best to avoid Bunnings for a bit then, in case she was tempted to try. Luckily, there weren't any in the library, where she'd be working for most of today. As long as she was awake enough to walk there, which would require coffee. She padded downstairs to the kitchen, where she managed to slot a pod into the coffee machine and fix herself a bowl of cereal, without giving in to the temptation that was the box of cannoli. But only just. Some time later, showered, dressed, and double-checked to make sure she hadn't stuck her shirt on inside out or anything, she brewed a second cup of coffee. She reached for her travel mug to pour it into for the walk to work, then checked the time and realized that waking up early had its advantages. She had time to drink this before she needed to leave for work. Her cup was empty too soon, though she didn't feel any more alert than when she'd woken up. Oh well, it should be quiet in the library today, so no one would notice if she was a little slower and sleepier than usual. Unless she fell asleep at the inquiries desk, of course. Now that would be embarrassing. No, she'd never be that unprofessional. Instead, she'd do her job and forget about research proposals for a few days. The dream gargoyle, okay, probably her own subconscious. Was right, and waiting was the way to go. She'd get the proposal in at the last minute anyway, just like everyone else. Right. Shoes. Wallet. Phone. Keys, where were her? Oh, there they were, under her sunglasses. She might need those because it was sunny today, even if it was winter. As ready as she'd ever be, Catena headed out the door for what she hoped would be a good day. 14. Miss. Are you the Mothman? Are you dating the Mothman? Miss. Miss. Do you know the Mothman? Catena hadn't even closed the outer door before they converged, coming at her from all directions with cameras and microphones and phones and so much shouting. So she did what she always did when someone started shouting at her. She bolted. 15. She extended her hand, palm out, stopping him. No. The thinnest stone veneer stood between him and the mob who surrounded her. The mob he needed to protect her from. Who was Miss Kelly to say no when protecting her was his purpose? Yet he obeyed, like the lowliest slave, for he knew what might happen if he did not. The whip of her words, sending him back into the darkness, where he could not protect her at all. The sun bathed the crowd then, as if it had lain in wait behind a cloud, ready to catch him in its grasp and turn him into a statue, if he had but ignored her command and waded into the fray. Light that haloed the mob who were anything but angels. Except the escaping scholar who had refused his help, running down the street with the morning light on her back. Safe, for none of them had given chase. Not like the man that first night, when she'd asked for his help, not said no. He could not say no. He was called to protect, to defend, to work. If he said no, then he would never be free. Free to choose to refuse what he did not want. Had he ever truly been free? Would he? The stone surrounding him weighed heavily on his shoulders. Tons of limestone filled with tiny shells that had once been free to swim in the sea, now as trapped as he was. Yet it still wasn't as heavy as chains. If he was free to choose, he would always choose stone over steel. Catena was a scholar, so much more educated than he would ever be. Perhaps she was right to say no, for she knew more than he did. He could see she was safe, slowing to a walk as she rounded the corner. 16. By the time she rounded the second corner, the journalists, or whatever they were, had given up on their pursuit, and Catena dared to slow down again and catch her breath. She'd emerged relatively unscathed from the scrum, but her travel cup of coffee was another matter. Catena sighed. She'd have to head to the staff room to make another cup, because the dregs of this one weren't worth drinking. Callie, the Latin lecturer, was already in there. Good morning, Catena greeted her. Callie held up her hand. Before you ask, let me stop you right there. No, I don't know anything about Mothmen. No, I didn't see it last night, and no, there are no historical accounts of anything even faintly resembling a Mothman in any part of my archives, because a Mothman is an urban myth, based on a hoax staged in some small town in America. There is no Mothman, there never has been a Mothman, and there never will be, because they do not exist. Had Callie seen the media crew outside her house? No, surely not. Evidently she'd been bitten by the same bug as those reporters. What is a Mothman, and why is everyone so interested in him all of a sudden? Catena asked, peeling off the lid of her cup and pouring what remained down the drain. Ugh, there was coffee everywhere, she'd have to wash and dry it before she dared take it into the library. Callie waved her hand in dismissal. It's a myth. The only reason everyone's talking about it is because someone dressed up in a bad Batman costume, filmed it, stuck in some special effects, and then posted the video online, where it's gone viral. Even the news websites have picked it up because it's the second monster sighting in Fremantle in the last month, or at least that's what they're saying. She snorted. As if zombies were real either. Catena wondered if she was still dreaming because none of this made sense. There's a zombie in Fremantle? Of course there isn't. Not even a fake one, someone would have caught it on camera if there was. No, it was a prank pulled by some high school kids, I'm sure of it. Someone dug up an old grave at the first Fremantle cemetery, left some hand and footprints in the soft soil around it. Like a zombie had risen or something, or at least that's the story the kids told when they got to the police station. Something about a man shambling away. If you ask me, they probably disturbed some homeless man sleeping in the bushes. Serves them right. Zombies and Mothmen. In Fremantle. What next? Catena managed a weak smile. Who'd have pegged Fremantle as Monster Central? In the movies, it's usually some American small town, or the seedy parts of one of their cities. What next? Vampires? Demons? The Winchester brothers? Callie shook her head. While I wouldn't say no to a visit from Sam and Dean, it's got to be a stunt. Monsters don't exist. At least, not the supernatural kind. Just people who do horrible things. She shrugged. Watch the video for yourself. Search up the Fremantle Mothman, you'll find it. See how fake it looks. We won't be hoping for a visit from the Winchesters or whatever their real-life equivalent is anytime soon. If only those reporters this morning had been as sensible as Callie. Ah, but it was all about sensation, wasn't it? Chasing a story. Speaking of stories, she'd have to make one up if she didn't get to the library right away, to explain why it hadn't opened on time. She could watch the video at her desk, when she had a moment. Then she'd know what a Mothman was and hopefully how to avoid anything to do with them ever again. The morning passed in a blur of inquiries, most of them students looking for yes information on the Mothman. It seemed like, the moment they finished their exams, they felt like the most appropriate thing to do was go chasing conspiracy theory monsters. She couldn't recall ever doing that after an exam. No, her post-exam celebrations had usually involved alcohol, not more research. The library cleared out shortly after lunch though, and that's when she dared to search for the silly video. She had to play it muted or risk disturbing someone still studying, but the images were enough. It looked like the video had been filmed from one of the upstairs windows across the street from her house, for she recognized the downstairs shops clearly enough. The Mothman, who did look like Batman, she had to admit, spread his cape or wings or whatever he wore wide, and she watched herself run straight into him. The man chasing her threw his arms up in the air, skidded to a stop, then raced back the way he'd come, and Batman or Mothman or whoever he was just sort of spun toward the doorway, then disappeared. She had to watch it several times, but there was no mistaking the sweater she'd been wearing on Friday night, or how well the video tallied with her own memories. She'd run into someone and woken up in her own bed. She almost wished the video had been longer, showing the moments after her memories went blank, but that's all there was. She should be thankful it didn't show her face, or the reporters this morning wouldn't have let her go so easily. Oh damn, the reporters, how long would they wait outside her house? Surely not all day. If they were waiting for her when she came home. Excuse me. I was wondering if you could tell me where I could find books about the Mothman? Catena looked up from her screen and into the bloodshot eyes of a student who definitely pulled an all-nighter before today's exam. If he only had the presence of mind to pull out his phone and spend 5 minutes searching the internet. She sighed and gave him her polite smile for stupid children. We don't have any fiction in this library. Perhaps the City of Fremantle's public library can help you. They're up near the town hall. She'd been saying the same thing all day, but this guy seemed more crestfallen than the rest. Oh. 'Kay then. I guess I'll try there then. He shambled off. Catena sincerely hoped he fell into bed for a decent night's sleep, before heading to any other libraries. Now she had to hope there wouldn't be anyone in the way, when she went home to her bed tonight. 17. All day Tor stewed about his failure. What he should or should not have done. Even as he thought of questioning Miss Kelly, he heard the clink of chains echoing in his mind. He knew the weight of them on his wrists, his ankles, the tight canvas cuffs strapped around him to stop the chafing, but it was never enough, worn thin from use. It was those ghostly chains that kept him within the walls, obedient to her will, until the sun sank beneath the horizon, and finally, far too long after that, she returned. Light clicked on in the kitchen, her things clattering to the bench. Light that drew him like a moth to the warmth of her flame. Not that she had any flames or fires in this house. It was quite strange, really. She had fireplaces, but no grates and no fires were laid. He knew they had to keep warm somehow, and then there was cooking. Miss Kelly did not look undernourished, so there must be some way she cooked her meals. Or maybe someone else cooked for her, so she had no need to risk a fire in her house. And yet, no one had come to visit or bring her meals the whole time he'd been guarding her. So that could not be it. He'd simply have to ask her. And hope that she would not punish him for questioning her. He offered up a silent prayer that Miss Kelly would be both merciful and forthcoming, then took a deep breath and stepped forth into her presence. 18. She stayed on the other side of the street on her walk home. If the press crew was still camped outside her front door, she'd see them in time to detour around the corner and sneak in the back door. Catena found a crowd all right, but they weren't at her house. Instead, they were milling around outside the cafe over the road from her. The cafe with upstairs windows set at just the right angle for that video to have been taken from one of them. She scrutinized the crowd. Was the person who'd filmed that video standing among them? It could be any of them, she decided. Most of them had their phones out, while clutching a coffee in their other hand, all avidly watching the footpath in front of her house. Catena sighed. The back door it'd have to be then. Around the corner, through the tiny car park courtyard and up the steps to the back door. A quick twist of the key and she was in, clicking the door closed behind her as she prayed no one had noticed. Past the storage room doors, which she'd never opened, and up another short flight of steps to the main entrance hall. Then up the grand staircase, a little more unlocking, and she was safely inside her apartment. Her next mission, to work out what to have for dinner. She had a hankering for pasta, but she couldn't remember if she'd left the mince for the bolognese sauce in the fridge, or the freezer. Damn, it looked like she'd frozen it in. Well, she had mushrooms and bacon. Together with a creamy sauce, those would work well with pasta. She seized the packet of bacon and carried it over to the bench. Or at least she tried to. The packet dropped from her nerveless fingers about halfway there, when she caught sight of the man standing in her kitchen. The bloody Mothman from the video, no less. Catena didn't think. She grabbed the chef's knife from the knife block, pointed it firmly in his direction and said, "Who the fuck are you and what the fuck are you doing in my house?" She was rather proud of how her voice didn't shake, though her knees definitely wanted to. The man, for of course he was just a man, Mothmen didn't actually exist, was massive. Built like the proverbial brick dunny, especially when he folded his arms like that, making the muscles bulge. He was so wide she almost didn't see his wings at first, jutting out from his shoulders but folded back behind him like a long leather trench coat. Except it wasn't a trench coat, because his brawny shoulders were as bare as the rest of him. No shirt, no, holy hell, he needed to put some pants over that thing, because he was definitely proportionate in all the right places. "Miss Kelly?" She jerked her gaze up from his groin to his face. "Miss Kelly, I'm Tor, your sworn protector. You summoned me." No, she definitely remember summoning a naked man in her kitchen. One with fake wings strapped to his back somehow, because those couldn't possibly be real. Mothmen didn't exist. "That's not possible," she said, trying and failing to sound like she believed her own words. Because there was no way she was hallucinating Hercules here in her kitchen. "I assure you it is. You summoned me the other night to rescue you from your pursuer, and I did. I am here to protect you. That is my purpose." He really was the Mothman, or at least the man in the video. She had to get a closer look at his wings. Then she'd know they were fake. Turn around. Show me your wings, she ordered. He inclined his head, then did as she asked. At a quick glance, she might have mistaken his folded wings for a trench coat, but then he began to extend them like a giant bat spread from one wall to the other all the way across her kitchen. Massive wingspan, which she imagined he'd need in order to lift all those muscles off the ground. Yep, that back. All those bunched up muscles supporting the weight of his wings right down to his dimples. Well, she'd never understood how someone's ass could look like a perfect peach, but there was the evidence right there. Two gorgeous globes that she really shouldn't be staring at. Dean Winchester would die of envy if he saw these. Would you like to touch them? Yes. Actually, she'd like to reach out and squeeze to see if those butt cheeks felt as luscious as they looked. Catena cleared her throat, trying to break herself out of this lust-filled trance. She was not considering groping the stranger in her kitchen. Not at all. No, you can put them away, thanks. Now tell me how you got in here. She folded her arms across her chest in a desperate attempt to stop herself from reaching for the strange man. Why, the same way I did when I saved you the other night. Through the walls. Through the walls. That made no sense. Wait, ghosts could walk through walls. Well, if they existed, which she wasn't exactly sure about. Are you a ghost? She demanded. Tor laughed softly. No, Miss Kelly. I'm as corporeal as you. See? He extended his hand toward her, palm up. She brandished the knife. You stay back. Don't come any closer. Yet her free hand reached out, yearning to take his, or at least to touch. She touched the tip of her index finger to his palm. Warm and hard, just as she expected him to feel. Swallowing, she stroked her hand across his just the once. His skin was rough, like he didn't moisturize much. Or maybe it was calluses from working for a living, because he had to do something strenuous all day to have muscles like that. You can put down the knife, Miss Kelly. I assure you I am here to protect you, and I mean you no harm. If you try to cut me, you would only blunt the blade, for my skin is not as fragile as yours. He reached out and ran his hand along the blade, then showed her his palm. No blood, though there was a little dust. As if the blade had scraped. I'm made of living stone, the better to protect you. What are you? If he said he was the Mothman, she was going to throw the knife at him, Catena decided. I'm a gargoyle, your stone protector. Catena burst out laughing. Of all the things he could have said, this was the last one she'd expected. My gargoyle is up on the roof. He's round and grotesque, not built like. She gestured at the length of his body, only to find herself staring again. Damn it, could you put on some pants already? Tor's eyes followed her gaze. Oh, please forgive me, Miss Kelly. He brought one of his wings around so that it covered his groin. If you provide me with the appropriate livery, I would be only too happy to wear it. Livery. Wasn't that something to do with horses and stables? Or servants? Yeah, it was a uniform, wasn't it? That rich people made their servants wear, and they had the same mark on all their stuff? Not people like her who scraped by on a part-time librarian's wage or the pittance of a PhD scholarship, if she could actually secure one. You must have made a mistake. You can't be my protector. I'm not the sort of person who needs a protector. I'm nobody, she insisted. Tor shook his head. Miss Kelly, if I were not your protector, you could not have summoned me. Therefore, when you called for me and I came, I became your protector. You are not nobody. In fact, you are so important that protecting you is my sole purpose. It was the reason I became a gargoyle in the first place. I live only to serve you. He bowed deeply, like he'd stepped out of a Regency romance and not the wall like he'd said. How did the wall thing work then? Fine. You're my protector then, I guess. Whatever that means. But how do you walk through walls? I am living stone and your walls are also made of stone. I simply slip through them like a fish swimming through water. He turned, flashing that glorious butt again, before he stepped into the wall and disappeared. A moment later his foot poked out, then a leg, then oh God, don't stare at his groin, oh God, before Tor stood before her again looking pretty pleased with himself. It had to be some sort of trick. One that involved mirrors or something. Catena wanted to believe it was a trick, but this was her kitchen. The one with solid limestone walls that had stood for more than a century. She could not deny she'd seen him walk into that stone wall and then step out again. But if he had, then he wasn't just a man. He was more than that, something supernatural, which couldn't possibly exist. Her mind whirled furiously, trying to put the pieces together. Worse, she wanted to believe. So on Friday night, when you first appeared and you grabbed me, you took me inside the walls all the way up to my bedroom? Tor frowned. Yes. I must apologize, for it was the first time I had tried traveling through stone with someone, and I did not realize you would not be able to breathe. It was only when we reached your bedchamber that I realized you had swooned. I did not know where you kept your smelling salts, so I waited until you awoke, presented my apologies and returned to the walls as it was near dawn. Do you not remember? Vaguely, but she'd thought he was a dream. God, had he been watching her sleep? Worse than the vampire in Twilight. And vampires couldn't hide in the walls. He could have been watching her in the shower or, wait, what had he just said? Dawn? What's the deal with Dawn? You're not a vampire, are you? She asked. I'm not sure what a vampire is, Miss Kelly. Catena smothered a laugh. Fancy that. A supernatural creature who didn't know everything about all the other kinds of monsters. Or maybe that was just because vampires didn't exist and Tor did. Our blood-sucking pale skin afraid of sunlight can't enter your house unless you invite them. Well, that definitely ruled Tor out then. Tor chuckled, a rumbling sound that did peculiar things to Catena's belly. It sounds like a villain in a gothic novel. Or so I believe, for I haven't read many myself. Perhaps you have been doing too much reading, Miss Kelly, to imagine such wild things. Like a ripped, naked gargoyle in her kitchen. She wanted this all to be a figment of her imagination. Then again, maybe she didn't. If she could maybe make sense of this in her head, make sense of him, she'd get to stare at him for a few minutes more before he puffed out of existence, like all good hallucinations. But the Dawn thing, she prompted. Like your vampire, I do have a weakness when it comes to sunlight. In the sun's rays, I turn to stone, much like the statue on your rooftop. Horror overcame Catena. You mean the statue is alive, trapped there in stone? No, the statue on your roof is no more than a statue. Ordinary stone. I can slip inside of it as easily as I do the walls. If I were to sit on your roof at dawn, you would find a statue much like I am now. Muscles. Wings. No pants, so the whole world would see he's massive. Forever? No, of course not. Just until the sun went down, and then I would be myself again. I would still see and hear everything around me, just as I do when I'm within the walls. I just couldn't move while I was still in sunlight. Which is why I spend my days sheltering within your walls. She wasn't sure why his words gave her a warm feeling inside, but somehow they did. Hadn't Maria said something similar on her visit yesterday? She talked about the gargoyle in the house too, but had she meant Tor and not the statue on the roof? If Maria knew about him, then maybe he really was the protector he'd said he was. Which meant he belonged here more than Catena did. How long have you been here, Tor? She asked. He lifted his shoulders in a massive shrug. I do not know. I've been in the darkness, awaiting your call. Poor man. No, poor gargoyle. What's your last memory before darkness? A wince of pain creased his expression for only a moment, before it was gone. I have no memories before the darkness. Then I heard your call and emerged into the light. A strange light burning without fire. Most strange. So Tor was from a time before electric lights. Maybe he was as old as the house, or even older. Miss Kelly, may I presume to ask you a question? He asked. It had been a long time since she'd learned about light globes and electricity at school, but she figured she could remember enough to talk him through it. If that failed, she'd pull out her phone and show him a picture. Sure, she said. 19. Tor took a deep breath. Miss Kelly, I am your protector. It's my sole purpose to see that you don't come to harm. So why did you not permit me to help you against that mob this morning? Did you not think me capable of doing so? Catena blew out a breath of her own. She'd been ready to talk about magnets and electrons, but talking a guy down from performance anxiety was much more her style. She beamed at him. Tor, it only takes one look at you to tell me that you're the best protector anyone could have. I mean, that guy on Friday night only had to look at you before he ran away. If I had to imagine the best bodyguard in the world, you'd be the super ultra mega deluxe version with all the extras only world leaders can afford. Then why did you not allow me to protect you this morning? I didn't even know you were here, or that you would protect me. Come to think of it, the sun was well and truly up this morning. Wouldn't you have just turned to stone anyway? Tor drew himself up. That would not have stopped me. I would have driven them off from the shadows in the doorway, letting loose an almighty roar to terrify them, before appearing in their midst. By the time I turned to stone, they would have all fled in horror, leaving a naked gargoyle statue in the doorway for everyone to photograph, bringing even more people tomorrow. Horror, all right. But she lived here, she couldn't flee from it. She swallowed. You can't go out the front door. Not when there are people out there. They'll see you and then they'll film you and then they'll never leave us alone. Of course they will. Am I not terrifying? Well, yes, but am I not a capable protector? She couldn't deny that, either. Of course you are, Tor, but they're not here to attack me. They're here to see you, and the more they see of you, the more they'll come here. This is lunacy. What manner of person likes to be terrified, likes it so much that they return for more? Millions of horror movie fans, not to mention readers of Gothic novels. Even she'd read a few Stephen King books, until the sleepless nights and nightmares had gotten to her and she'd had to stop. In fact, the only horror film she'd ever managed to watch a second time was The Mummy, for obvious reasons. A lot of people. Probably crazy people, yes, but they find it entertaining. Look, if you stick around, I'll watch The Mummy with you and you can see what I mean. But right now, there's a cafe full of people over the road dying for a glimpse of you or a picture on their phone. And if they get so much as a single blurry picture, tomorrow there will be 2 or 3 or even 10 times as many people. So you have to stay inside where they can't see you. Tor blinked. Maybe it was a lot to take in for a gargoyle who'd only been awake for 3 days, after sleeping who knew how long. Miss Kelly, I find this very hard to believe, though I do not believe you would lie to me. I must observe these lunatics for myself, for if they are a danger to you, I cannot allow them to remain. Even if they make pictures of me. Catena buried her face in her hands. Tor, you can't. Look, I'll take you up to the roof. Hopefully they won't see us up there, and I can show you what I mean. Come on. This time she held out her hand and Tor took it. His grip was warm and gentle, as if he feared he might break her fingers if he held on too tight. He probably could too. She led him upstairs, then up through the French doors to the rooftop. The moment the wind hit her, straight off the sea and likely fresh from the South Pole, she wished she'd thought to bring a coat. Oh well, they'd only be out here a moment. Then Tor emerged, and his spread wings blocked the breeze. Catena wanted to turn around and hug him, but she managed to stifle the urge, and led him to the edge of the rooftop instead. Ducking down behind the gargoyle statue, she could feel the heat of Tor crouching in close behind her. "Look, there's the cafe across the road from us," she said, pointing at the shut-up cafe. She'd never noticed the name before. Evidently, the noisy patrons outside hadn't either. "Everyone out there is watching the entrance to our place, where you first appeared on Friday night. They're watching and waiting, hoping to take a picture. They don't look like lunatics, but what are they all doing, crowding around outside when there are tables and chairs to spare inside? Perhaps they are crazy after all. There's a better view outside. With all the bright light inside, you can't see what's going on in the shadows across the street, which is what they really want to see. Besides, you can't get a good picture through glass." She wondered if she'd have to explain photography to Tor too. "I see." He peered out at them, as if searching for something that he couldn't find. "What I don't see is anyone about to make a picture. Not a sketchpad or pencil among them. I can't imagine how a picture could be a bad thing. It takes considerable skill and practice to become a good artist, so I don't imagine 1 in 1,000 could create a passable picture that looks anything like me. Or why I should care if they did." Catena could feel a headache coming on. How could she explain what a viral video was to a man who didn't understand the existence of phone cameras? She'd have to try. Because between Tor's size and his ability to walk through walls, she hadn't a hope of stopping him if he wanted to go outside and confront the cafe patrons. She took a deep breath. "Okay, you see those things in their hands? Those rectangular things?" She waited for Tor to nod, then pulled her own phone out of her pocket. "This is mine. It's a communications device that allows me to take pictures and share them with everyone in the world. Through a thing called the Internet, a sort of invisible network that goes right round the world." To her surprise, she found Tor nodding. "We called it the ether." That sounded like something to do with alchemy, or weird science theories that got debunked centuries ago. "Ah yeah, something like that. Anyway, it can instantly take a picture of anything it sees, and share it. A machine does not have eyes. It cannot see anything." No, she was not going to try to explain robotics to him. "Will you just trust me for a moment, okay? It's a lens, not an eye, but the principle is the same. Here, look at this and smile." She pointed at the lens on her phone, waited for him to stare at it, then snapped a picture. Definitely not a vampire. She flipped her phone around to show him. "See?" He peered at it. "That looks like me, but how?" Explaining camera phones was way beyond her level of expertise. Plus she was hungry, damn it. Catena threw an arm around Tor's shoulders, leaned back, and held up her phone. She thumbed the screen to use the front camera instead of the rear one. "Smile for your first selfie." "Hey, that's me." She snapped a shot of his smile of wonderment, and had to admit, she didn't look too bad in the photo either. A pity she'd never be able to show it to anyone, because no one would believe gargoyles existed. She'd still save it though, so that she could take it out and look at it to remind herself that she hadn't dreamed this. Wait, what was that poking her in the back? All hard and pokey, and oh God, was that his? "Please forgive me, Miss Kelly, I seem to have gotten tangled up in your clothing." He shifted, and then he was heating the pocket of her sweater instead. "We need to get you some pants," she bit out, closing her eyes so she wouldn't see anything as he extracted his wayward appendage. Of course, she couldn't help peeking a little. If anything, he'd actually gotten bigger and harder. Had their little hug given the gargoyle a hard-on? It seemed that it had. "Huh. When he'd managed to disentangle them and backed up enough for her to get past, she led the way back inside, to the laundry, where Maria had kept all her dig clothes. My godmother used to keep a collection of men's cargo pants in here, to wear when she went out to archaeological sites. You should be able to find something to fit you in one of these drawers. She waved at them. When you're decent, you can come find me in the kitchen, where I'll be making dinner. She marched off, determined not to think about his monster dick, and what it might feel like somewhere more personal than her pocket. Definitely not thinking about sleeping with the gargoyle, riding him hard for half the night. Nope. Not at all. Would it even fit? Nope. Not thinking about it at all. 20. Tor was surprised to find she did indeed have some pants that fitted him. They were made from a heavy, cream-colored cotton and fastened at the waist with a length of cord, cunningly hidden on the inside. So much finer than the scratchy fustian he'd been forced to wear before. These suited him better than any livery. He must thank Miss Kelly. Almost without thinking, he slipped through the walls to arrive in the kitchen, where he found her stirring something in a pan on the stove. A blue flame did indeed appear underneath the pan, solving the mystery of her meals. "Oh good, you found some," she said. Tor glanced down. It appeared his pants could travel through walls as well, or at least while he was wearing them. Good. For if a single touch from Miss Kelly could arouse him so powerfully, he was her protector, not her paramour, even if someone like Miss Kelly would consider taking a lover. She'd never choose someone as lowly as him. Best he remember that. "I'm making enough for two in case you want some. I usually make extra so I can have leftovers for later," Miss Kelly said, still stirring. The appetizing aroma of bacon rose up to assail his nose. Damn, he hadn't eaten bacon no, he could not remember that either. "I have no need for sustenance being made of stone," he said sadly. He'd make an exception for that bacon though. "You don't have to eat? Not ever? I can't imagine what that must be like. To never taste bacon." Tor swallowed. "I remember what bacon tastes like, so I must have eaten it once. Not that I remember when." She stared at him. "So you haven't always been a gargoyle then?" He shrugged. "I can remember nothing of my past." Miss Kelly had a deft hand with a knife, as she alternated between slicing mushrooms and stirring the bacon. "You sound Scottish. Is that where you're from? Do you remember anything from there?" she pressed. Tor racked his brain but came up with nothing. "Wherever I came from, this is my home now." These words rang with truth. Memory twinged just the tiniest pang of yearning, before it was gone, too quickly to grasp. "I have no memory of anywhere else." "Is that a gargoyle thing? Are there any other gargoyle things I should know, like your issue with sunlight?" Tor pondered. "I don't know. I've never met another gargoyle. I only know that I am bound to serve and protect, and I will." Miss Kelly scraped the mushrooms into the pan. "That doesn't seem fair. You do all the hard work, serving and protecting and sleeping in the darkness for who knows how long, waiting to be called, and what do you get out of it? Sounds like slavery to me, and that was abolished a long time ago." What could he say? "It is my purpose." Protecting me sounds like a pretty shitty purpose in life. Isn't there anything you want to do? There was something dancing on the tip of his tongue, tingling at his fingertips, just out of reach, but whatever it was, Tor could not grasp it. Perhaps there was once, but not anymore. "I am what I am and no more." He coughed. "If you'll forgive my impertinence, I wish to ask another question." "Just ask, Tor. I've already forgiven you for accidentally sticking your dick in my pocket, so let's just assume I'm okay with a bit of impertinence, as long as you're wearing pants, okay?" Tor almost choked. Miss Kelly, are all lady scholars of this time as outspoken as you, or is it just your tongue that is unusually salty? Miss Kelly laughed. I don't know what time you're actually from, but I'm beginning to think it's a lot different to this one. No one's ever called me a lady scholar before, though I admit I kind of like it. And I'm probably no more salty than most of the women I know. Oh, and drop the Miss Kelly thing. My name is Catena, or occasionally Cat. This is Australia. We don't do honorifics unless we really hate someone, or maybe if they're the Prime Minister. Come to think of it, yeah, definitely the Prime Minister on both counts at the moment. We've got a real dickhead in office right now. You're not what I expected. She snorted. Well, you're definitely not what I expected. If anyone had told me I'd have a conversation with a gargoyle in my kitchen, I wouldn't have believed them. Yet here we are. She busied herself about the kitchen, putting things in pots, then pouring them out again until she filled a bowl with long, stringy things before spooning the mushroom and bacon sauce over the top. I feel bad eating in front of you when you can't and all. Is there anything I can get you? She said. It sounded silly, but something made him say it anyway. May I just sit near you so that I might smell it? Even if I can't eat it, I can enjoy the scent, for it smells quite delicious. She grinned. I can do you one better. I'll put all the leftovers in a box, then set it in front of you, so you can sniff to your heart's content while it cools off. She might have a salty tongue, but she certainly was remarkably thoughtful. Thank you, Miss Catena. And when we're done, we're going to watch The Mummy. Aren't those from Egypt? He ventured. Her smile widened. Indeed they are. This movie's set there. It's about a lady scholar and librarian, and an archaeological dig in Egypt, where they dig up something they shouldn't. It sounds like a Gothic novel. Does it? For all that you said you didn't read them, you sure know a lot about them. Maybe you've read more than you're willing to admit. Try as he might, Tor could not remember reading much of anything, but he followed Catena into the next room to see whatever it was she wanted to watch. 30. Tor hadn't expected that. He thought for a moment. The best thing about being able to fly was the view from up here, higher than anyone else, and the freedom to land wherever he wanted, or fly away again as the fancy took him. What he wanted was to hold Catena in his arms forever, breathing in her scent as she pressed her soft body against him. But he didn't want to fly too high or too far with her, lest he tire his wings too much and he'd have to make her walk home. That would be an ignominious end he didn't even want to contemplate. He might not be able to fly forever with her in his arms, but he wanted to do it again and again and again, something she'd never allow if he messed this up. So he surveyed the port city spread out before him, and picked a tall building that towered over all the others, but had a flat roof that would be forgiving if he botched the landing. Fremantle Hospital, the sign out the front said, in big red letters. He glided in, then tipped his wings back and dropped, bending his knees to soften the landing as he hit the roof. You could see the whole city from here, the fishing boat harbor, the twinkling lights of the city buildings, and the well-lit port at the river mouth beyond. What's that? Catena asked. Instead of looking at the view, she was pointing at a 2-story building behind the hospital. Tor blinked. A building he knew. That's the Knoll, the Controller General's residence. Built for a man named Henderson who was in charge of all the convicts here, he said. Memory stirred, of paper plans crackling in his hands. Architectural plans, of a beautiful house that was smaller than the building it had now become, but still a great house. How do you know that? She asked. I've lived here all my life, and I didn't even know it existed. Because I built it, he said. That had been in the early days here, when they still respected him, saw him as the master mason he was and not some common convict. He turned their crude shell of a commissariat into a proper warehouse, where goods could be stored without the waves carrying them away every time there was a storm, so they'd been only too happy to hand over the construction of the grand house to him. A house that stood still. "You built it," she said slowly. "You remember?" "A little," he admitted. Common laborers had cut the stone and he directed them where he wanted it, fitting them seamlessly together into walls to stand the test of time. Those had been good days. Then the engineers had arrived and they'd started building the prison. What was Fremantle like then? "I can't even imagine," she breathed, then shivered. There might not be a breeze, but clear nights could get cold as well, he knew. Tor wrapped his wing around her, pulling her to his side to keep her warm. He stretched out his hand to point. Most of the buildings here weren't even built yet, and the port was out there, not in the river. Tall ships bobbing at anchor, a forest of masts as far as the eye could see. Bringing supplies and convicts, for the colony had little more than timber and stone of its own even then. None of this grassed esplanade either. Just a stretch of shore which flooded at every high tide. The waves would wash up the steps of the buildings along the shore, and sometimes even inside. They were all warehouses then, even the Esplanade Hotel. Places to store goods and men in chains, identified by numbers not names. Every second building was a hotel or a drinking house. There was even a whole street of brothels. He remembered himself. "Beg pardon, Miss Kelly. I should not have spoken of those." She laughed. "Have you ever been in one, Tor? Handed over hard-earned cash for a night of wanton sex? Or could you only afford an hour? I've heard stories about the brothels back in the gold rush days. They had the girls in stalls like a horse stable, and they spent the whole night on their feet, up against the stall wall." If it were possible, Tor would be blushing furiously. "It seems you know more than I do, Miss Kelly. I have never, I did not." "You've never paid for sex, I take it. Or worked in a brothel. Well, that makes two of us. I'm not sure I could share my body with a stranger like that. To be that close to someone I didn't love, or at least have feelings for." She gave a shudder, which set every nerve in his wing afire. No, his whole body. She was close to him. Did that mean she had fond feelings for him? He didn't dare hope, and yet. What else was built then? I know the roundhouse was. Tor mentally shook himself and tried to remember. The memories came easier now. Maybe it was because of her, because she'd asked him. He was hers to command after all. The roundhouse was there, yes, and the commissariat, the building that is the shipwreck gallery now, with all the anchors out the front. The warders' cottages, all those houses along there. The prison was still being built, the southern half of the building there now, along with the walls and the gatehouse. They hollowed out the hill for it, quarrying the stone, then lifting it to the top of what remained of the hill, to make it harder for the prisoners to escape. Of course, that only made the wall unstable. He trailed off. Pointing out the wall's weaknesses had earned him chains and pain. He was surprised to see the wall still standing. He opened his mouth to comment on it. I can't imagine what the convicts thought about all of it. I know they were criminals, convicted of some rather horrible crimes, which they deserved to pay for, a debt to society, and they did, building this city and high street and so many other things, but to make them build their own prison. Even the most hardened criminal had to have broken at the thought of those tiny cells, those thick walls, to know that when it was finished, there'd be no escape. Yes. That's why he'd listened to the butcher, and taken his chance before the walls were finished. Trading one form of servitude for another, but his choice had brought him her. She was in his arms now, and even if he was only her protector, it was more than he could have ever hoped before, when his whole future looked to be locked up in a limestone cell. I guess they got what they deserved, she said softly. They did, but not him. He wanted what he didn't deserve. That's what had gotten him into this mess in the first place, a man daring to look above his station. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. I imagine they did, he said, for he was no longer one of them when the prison opened, and they were locked away. Tor. He stared at her. How long had he been lost in thought, completely ignoring her? It's really lovely up here, and I'm grateful you took me for a flight, but I'm absolutely freezing right now, even with your wing around me, and I'm afraid if I don't get home and warm soon, I won't be able to feel my feet. Some protector he was. Of course. If you'd put your arms around my neck again? This time he scooped her up in his arms, cuddling her to his chest to keep her warm as he flew her home.